Hello everyone and welcome to the Dry Dock episode 235. This week the questions are taken from Guide 280 on HMS Hotspur, the ironclad ram, and on Guide 281, which is the Arethusa class cruisers of the Royal Navy of the interwar period, coupled with the Wednesday videos on the Suez campaign and life generally in the Royal Navy, as well as the Wednesday video on HMS Unicorn, the museum ship in Dundee. So, with all that said, let's get on with questions. Christopher Babylon asks, were the resources spent converting the C-class into anti-aircraft cruisers worth it, or would the resources have been better spent on other ships? I think, broadly speaking, the amount of resources invested in the AA conversions of the C-class was probably money well spent. I mean, they're not the world's most dramatically capable anti-aircraft cruisers, to be perfectly fair. You've effectively got two flavours. You've got one version which has 10 single 4-inch guns and another version which has, as far as I can tell, 4 twin 4-inch mounts, so 8 4-inch guns. Albeit that the twin mount version, I think, actually has more practicality, because although it's got 2 fewer guns, some of the single gun conversion ones, the one with 10 guns, they have guns on the wings, whereas the all centerline twin mount conversions can put all 8 of their guns broadside, plus they have some pom-poms as well. On both sides, both of the versions have pom-poms, but one of the dedicated positions on the centerline with the twin mount version had a pom-pom specifically. Nonetheless, the refits were relatively quick. They seem to have taken about a year from decommission to recommission. And although it takes away, obviously, all of the ship's 6-inch guns, let's face it, a C-class cruiser, broadly speaking, is not really going to be able to use those 6-inch guns for all that much in terms of cruiser-on-cruiser combat. You know, okay, you could use them against destroyers, maybe, against some of the really, really, really small versions of the Condottieri, maybe, albeit the Condottieri are probably, they are a lot faster and probably will have better fire control systems than some of the older C-class. So realistically speaking, a 6-inch armed C-class is really only good at seeing off Hilfskreuzer and other armed merchant raiders and chasing down blockade runners and so forth. They're not really a frontline combat vessel, in my estimation, by the time of World War II, albeit they sometimes ended up there. Whereas the anti-aircraft conversions are used quite regularly on the front line, and a number of them are sunk as a result of that. But when you compare their anti-aircraft broadside to that of genericus cruiser mark cruiser, so the Arethusas, Leanders, and most of the towns, bar the Belfast and Edinburgh, once everybody's been refitted, because a lot of them started off with single mounts, but most of the time the average British cruiser has 4 4-inch anti-aircraft guns per side. They have 8 total, but it's usually in 4 twin mounts, 2 per side. And this 8 single or 4 twin anti-aircraft armament in terms of heavy anti-aircraft guns is basically standard across most of the interwar cruisers of varying flavours, especially US and Japanese ones. So by comparison, an anti-aircraft C-class conversion on the broadside brings around about double the heavy anti-aircraft firepower. And lots of 4-inch guns will still fend off destroyers and deal with merchant raiders and so forth relatively easily. And as I said, they're not really going to do all that much better or worse than their 6-inch armed cousins when it gets to if they have to engage an enemy cruiser. Now, is it ideal? No. It would be better to have a lot more Didos if they could get them, but they couldn't. So in the event, for a relatively small amount of invested resources, you actually put out a reasonable amount of firepower, at least for the early war period. And realistically, spreading out that number of guns over a bunch of different ships instead might have led to, maybe a ship or two in any given situation has an extra gun or two available to them, but that's not going to make as much of a difference overall as compared to rocking up with 8 or 10 4-inch guns in a concentrated dedicated vessel plus some pom-poms. Jake Miller asks, was HMS Hotspur's scrapping anything to do with Jackie Fisher? I can't find an exact date for her scrapping, so I don't know if that date fell within Fisher's tenure as First Sea Lord. Not directly, but kind of. So Hotspur was sold for scrap in August 1904. Fisher didn't become First Sea Lord until October 1904, and of course his reforms, which included scrapping of a bunch of obsolete ships, came after that. So Fisher himself was not directly responsible in terms of he didn't sign the paperwork that said this ship is going to the scrapyard. However, the presence of so many old and obsolete ships in the Royal Navy was becoming something of an issue in the early 1900s, 1900 through to 1904 already, and there was a bit of a press campaign going on about it. And as a result of that, some of the really old and really obsolete ships were gotten rid of, including Hotspur. Now, the reason why I say Fisher's only technically not involved is because if you've seen the 2-part video that I did with Matthew Wright on Admiral Fisher, you'll know that Admiral Fisher had a way of getting what he wanted a lot of the time by specific leaks to the press. And if you look at the various briefs from various naval officers, anonymous or not, in the early part of the 1900s, who were railing against these so-called coffin ships, well, it's not that difficult to put 2 and 2 together and get 4 and figure out that Fisher was, if not necessarily the heart of it, probably at least a major player in stirring the pot. Apart from anything else, it meant that once he got into being First Sea Lord and could make much more wide-sweeping reforms and scrappage schemes, he faced considerably less resistance as a result. And, well, he faced a fair degree of resistance anyway, so I'd say Hotspur's scrapping was probably at least in part due to Fisher paving the way for his later schemes by way of quietly encouraging the press. Frank Damaris asks, I ran across references to the battleship Richelieu and some other French ships with the same 6-inch guns using modified shells from the US 6-inch 47 Mark 16 gun. Modified how exactly? Bursting charge is the same, but the shell weight is very slightly reduced. Were the US shells precisely 6-inch, i.e. 152.4mm, but had to be machined down to precisely 152mm? Or is there any other data available comparing the penetration of French semi-armour piercing shell to the US armour piercing shell from these guns? I'm not immediately aware of direct comparison data of the 152mm shells of French origin as compared to the ones of US origin, although I suspect if there was anyone who might know it, at least in the English-speaking world, it would be John Jordan, since he literally wrote the book about them, again in English with cooperation from French authors, so maybe he might be worth an email. But in terms of the guns themselves, they are actually exactly 6 inches. For various reasons, the French have a bunch of 155mm, which is the more standard metric, near enough as makes no difference, equivalence to 6-inch, but they also did have an actual exact 6-inch gun, and that was used on some of their more modern light cruisers and on Richelieu, amongst other ships. Now, the shells would obviously have to be modified somewhat, although the rifle twist rate in Richelieu's guns is actually remarkably close to that in the 6-inch 47. It's not exact, although, as I said, the bore diameter is the same, so you can fit them in. So you would have had to make slight modifications to the 6-inch shell to ensure accuracy with a very slightly different rifle twist, the fact it's going to be in a much longer barrel weapon, and of course you'd also have to calibrate it given that the chamber, i.e. where the propellant goes, is considerably larger on a French gun than on the American gun, because of course they're using different propellants apart from anything else. So all of these minor calibrations, corrections, etc. will result in a slight variance in weight, albeit that the variance isn't exactly huge, and even where it's noted, the exact amount of weight difference does seem to change slightly from source to source. As you kind of mentioned, In some places, it's given as £129.6 as opposed to the £130 in a US cruiser, but in other places it's given as £129.9, which at that point is effectively, that's basically £130. That's just somebody happened to weigh that particular shell, and it was within tolerance but fractionally lighter. UNSC Forward Unto Dawn asks, do you think the Royal Navy would have been better off building more Arethusas alongside the later Town and Crown Colony classes and scrapping the older C and D class vessels, rather than curtailing the Arethusas and then modernising the World War I ships? Alternatively, what do you think was the best class of built-on-a-budget ships, both financial and weight-wise? In theory, absolutely yes, it would be better to replace much older, less capable ships with newer, more capable ships. However, we have to be realistic in that whilst the last of the Arethusas was laid down in 1935, and it was very evident shortly thereafter that the naval treaty system was collapsing, and therefore a rearmament could begin, you've still got to bear in mind that even with the rearmament, they were still operating on something of a budget, bearing in mind that, a few decades earlier, Admiral Fisher had listed in order of evil bureaucracy, Parliament, Satan, and then above all, the Treasury. So given that it took some years to go from keel laying to in service with the Arethusas, even though they were relatively small, given that you could modernise a C or D class in about a year or less, given the urgency of the rearmament effort, it made more sense, given financial and time constraints, to go as the Royal Navy did historically. If they'd had more money available, then I'm sure they would have preferred to build many, many more cruisers, but of course it wasn't, strictly speaking, curtail the Arethusas to modernise the old ships. It was more curtail the Arethusas in order to move on to the next great thing, which was building the Town class, and then modernising the Cs and Ds when they could. Then, if you wanted to go with, we're still building diminutives of light cruisers as well as the full-scale 10,000 tonners, then from 1935-36, I think that continuing with the Arethusas probably would have been a little bit of a mistake, as you probably will have reasoned out by now, given the time that this dry dock goes up relative to the other Wednesday videos. I'm a bit of a fan of the ARA La Argentina, which is effectively a slightly larger Arethusa, except with 3 triple turrets instead of 3 twins, and generally all round a better vessel. So given that at this stage of proceedings La Argentina would have been well underway, I think if they were going to build diminutives, it would have been much, much better to basically just go, right, we'll copy that and make a Royal Navy version of La Argentina with just a little bit more speed and a little bit less school space. Because effectively what you'd be doing is, for most intents and purposes, inventing a cheaper, smaller and lighter Crown Colony class several years ahead of when they were actually built. They wouldn't have been anywhere near as useful post-war, but for the wartime period they would have been considerably more capable. And of course, if you have unlimited budget, then you'd build the towns in the dockyards that can accommodate them, you'd build a British version of La Argentina in numbers in the slightly smaller yards that maybe can't fit a full-size town, and you'd take the Cs and Ds in and just convert them whole-scale into anti-aircraft cruisers. Jeff Brown asks, in your response to the question about age of sail damage control in Dry Dock 187, you mentioned only plugging holes with wood. I've read Age of Sail novels of hauling a spare sail around the outside of the hull to slow the inflow of water and give the carpenter more time. Was this actually a real thing? It was a real thing, but not especially common. The reason for this is actually a number of different factors. Firstly, if you have a simple shot hole, then that's relatively easily plugged, even if you've got lots of them. Secondly, sail canvas is quite valuable to a ship, as you might imagine. Even if it's a spare one or an old one, if you do this, you're probably not getting it back. So it's really got to be serious to sacrifice an entire sail to do so. Thirdly, it depends on the kind of ship. Obviously, larger ships carry larger sails, but their hulls are also considerably larger. And the process of getting a sail under the hull and then strapped on either side tightly enough to actually provide any kind of meaningful plug to water ingressing into the ship, that's going to actually require the hull to be somewhat smaller. Famously, Captain Cook did this at one point. So it's more likely to be seen on a bark or a sloop or a small frigate than it is perhaps, say, on a ship of the line. Another fact you've got to take into account is that obviously ships accumulate all sorts of wonderful marine growth on their undersides, especially in the age of sail. So if you're in a non-coppered vessel and you've been out at sea for a while and you pass a old sail under the hull, firstly, it's probably not going to get the world's most brilliant seal, and secondly, it's going to be absolutely shredded by barnacles and all other sorts of wonderful things attached. It might still happen with a coppered hull, but you're going to have to be out at sea a lot longer, which, combined with the value of the sailcloth, well, if it's going to be pointless anyway, why ruin a perfectly good sailcloth? So, for battle damage, the other factor is, of course, a large party of men bringing a huge sail on board and over the side and then trying to run it round the underside of the ship, etc., etc. That's not really going to work in battle. So for battle scale repairs, and for most general repairs, even after battle, carpenters below deck plugging holes and patching them with wood is pretty much going to be par for the course. However, with all that said, if you have serious wide-scale damage on your hull, so probably not cannon fire, because if you've been hit by that many cannonballs below the waterline, you've probably surrendered anyway, and the ship's probably lost. But if you have, say, run onto a big rock or hit a reef or something like that, which is what happened with Captain Cook's ship, and you've stove in the side over a considerable length and there's a lot of water coming in, but you otherwise want to save the ship and you're not currently being shot at, aka Captain Cook's situation, at that point, something like passing a sail around might well be worth it, because yes, you might lose the sail, yes, you probably can't reuse it afterwards, but at that stage you have the facility to do so, and it may be just about the difference between life and death, because it's going to take the carpenter a lot longer to fix and patch up a stove-in section of the ship from you hitting something than it is to plug a relatively simple cannonball shot. Samoylenko asks, are there some examples or any theoretical use of the all-backwards main armament scheme? Or were there any significant benefits of making things like the Königsbergs with an aft volley that was better than the forward volley? There were actually quite a few examples of an all-backwards armament scheme, some voluntary, many involuntary. So, for example, HMS Furious, in her initial incarnation as the world's most heavily armed aircraft carrier, had a single 18-inch gun aft, nothing forward, because she had a flight deck there. There's this wonderful thing, Scheme F, which was one of the many ideas percolating around in the early 1930s for the North Carolina class, and yes, that is 2 quad 14-inch turrets aft and a rather wonderful and interesting collection of aircraft catapults forward, creating a kind of reverse hybrid carrier. Yet don't ask what they were on at that point. Then you had the Matsushima class cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which were effectively designed to make a kind of conga line of small ships that theoretically could simulate a larger pre-dreadnought, where 2 of the ships were supposed to have a single 12-inch gun forward, and 2 of the ships were supposed to have a single 12-inch gun aft, and then the 2 ships with the guns forward would sail at the head of a column of 4, and the 2 ships with the aft guns would sail at the aft of the column of 4. Yeah, don't ask either. In the end, they only ended up building 1 with the aft-facing gun and cancel the 4th one, which was to have been its pair. But this idea of sailing multiple ships in formation with single, much larger than average guns collectively forming some kind of weird hybrid battleship equivalent was definitely a thing at that kind of time period. I think the Swedes did that as well with one of their monitors, or certainly one of the Scandinavian countries did. As far as any benefits of making your aft salvos stronger than your forward salvos, obviously, as you mentioned with the Königsbergs, that's relative. With ships like this Scheme F, it's absolute. Mainly, it's down to two reasons. One is that you've got something better to do with the forward part of the ship that requires the forward part of the ship. Now, in Furious or Scheme F's case, that's aircraft handling. In the Matsushima class's case, or at least supposed to have been half of them, that's because you're supposed to be covered by the forward guns of something else. And so in those cases, there's something of more importance that in theory is giving you the same or greater firepower equivalents, and it just happens to need the forward part of the ship rather than the aft part of the ship for whatever reason. Whereas with the more relative examples where you do still have a forward turret like the Königsbergs, the only real advantage, practically speaking, is that if you have an unequal number of turrets, so in the case of 3 triples you have 2 aft and 1 forward, then it means that a majority of your firepower can still be directed at targets aft of you, which means that if you're expecting to perhaps, say, run away from a considerable number of targets, or people who are trying to make you into their target, then it has certain advantages. But generally speaking, both from a general engineering and ship design view, if you don't have a particularly aggressive reason for eliminating the forward turret or turrets, there's not really that much to speak for having an aft-mounted only main battery. Knight6831 asks, why were the British slow to adopt the all-or-nothing armour scheme? Was it because it was unproven, or was there more to it? Well, technically speaking, it's not the British adopting the all-or-nothing armour scheme, it's them re-adopting it, considering that they actually pretty much invented the idea with HMS Warrior, and then dropped it in favour of the distributed armour scheme, and then brought it back again in the 1920s. And secondly, whilst there is quite a gap between the British designs that use all-or-nothing armour of the very, very late 1910s and early 1920s as compared to USS Nevada, as seen here, the first all-or-nothing ship designed in the US, at the same time, the British are the second navy to adopt all-or-nothing armouring, albeit that is because Russia's in the middle of a revolution, Germany's just been defeated in the First World War, and the French are bankrupt, as are the Italians, so nobody else is able to build battleships at this point, except for, I suppose, the Japanese. But part of the reason, or a good chunk of the reason why the British were a little bit slow on the uptake in hindsight when it comes to all-or-nothing armour, is down to a couple of major factors. Firstly, expected range of combat. Now, this is something I've mentioned multiple times on previous dry docks. As rangefinders and fire control were developing in the 1900s and 1910s, everybody had a very different idea of what ranges battles would be fought at. The French were at the very bottom end, then the Germans, then the British, and then the Americans, who thought gunfire was going to be at extremely long ranges relative for the period, for the most part. People swap places on that list a little bit. And of course, other navies had other ideas as well, but from the big navies of the period, that's the approximate order of things. And so with the US thinking, right, we're going to have very long-range gunfire, that means hits to the decks are more likely, and since deck armour costs an awful lot more in terms of displacement per square inch of armour added as compared to belt armour, because a deck of the same length as the ship's belt actually occupies far more surface area than even the two corresponding belts on either side, obviously, combined. That meant you had to start making some serious weight savings where armour was concerned. And the US Navy was primarily looking directly over the Atlantic at the Royal Navy as the measure of what it would be facing up against. And since the Royal Navy was kind of leading the pack for the most part in terms of gun size, the US was thinking, okay, well, engagement's going to happen at long range, we need to free up as much weight as possible for deck armour, and we're also facing off potentially, at least in theory, against ships with very large caliber weapons, which means very heavy shells, which in theory also means significant penetration power even out to these long ranges. Thus, we need to concentrate every bit of weight we allocate to armour over the vitals, the magazines, the machinery, to defend them against this theoretical, very significant threat. Now, if you don't think that combat is going to happen at quite that level of long range, you don't need quite as much deck armor, because if you think combat's going to happen at shorter range, then the shells are going to come in at a shallower angle, so a thinner amount of deck armor will suffice for protection, which means you have weight to free to distribute to other areas. And then this factors into two other things the British, as compared to the Americans, are thinking about. The British are looking at everybody's guns, but rather understandably, in the run-up to and during World War I, they're looking primarily at the Germans, and until the Germans put Bayern and Baden in the water, they're dealing with opponents who are firing 11 and 12-inch shells. And an 11 or 12-inch shell can be resisted at medium to long ranges by somewhat thinner armour than a battleship's main belt. So 9-inch armour, for instance, as you see on the 13.5-inch British battle cruisers. And if you're also fighting a little bit closer in, you might be subjected to secondary gunfire or cruiser gunfire, at which point, again, thinner armour to protect areas of the ship that might get riddled and flooded, which is undesirable, is going to be somewhat beneficial. The other thing, in a case of, well, we have it, therefore our enemies probably do as well, is the British have the CPC shell, which you may have heard me mention before, i.e. the common pointed capped shell, which is effectively a halfway house between an armour-piercing and a high-explosive shell. It doesn't quite have the same armour-piercing potential as an AP shell, but it carries a considerably greater explosive charge and is therefore more likely to set fires, and obviously will distribute fragments around the ship with considerably more energy. And if you assume that the enemy must also have some form of CPC shell equivalent, then again the need for more widespread armour becomes obvious, because if you've got this shell that can penetrate small amounts of armour and then explode to devastating effect inside the ship with considerable power, then it makes sense to have thinner armour in the distributed armour style across a greater portion of the ship, because that thinner armour should be able to stop CPC shell, especially if the CPC shell is coming from the smaller 11 or 12-inch guns that you're most likely to face. However, during World War I, multiple things become apparent to the British that gradually knock down these assumptions. Firstly, it turns out nobody else seems to be doing the CPC thing, and the British themselves quietly drop it during the First World War. Secondly, it turns out that gun ranges are actually significantly in excess of what anybody thought was going on, which therefore returns back to the US reasoning about deck armour. And thirdly, Germany starts putting the Bayerns and Badens in the water, at which point 15-inch shells, even at medium or long range, even if they were CPC, would probably punch quite happily through a 6, 7 or 9-inch belt. So with all those issues knocked down by advances or discoveries that the British were coming across during the First World War, all of their remaining reasons for retaining partially distributed armour become moot, at which point all of the reasoning pretty much loops back in with what the US was thinking back in the early part of the 1910s, and along comes the British all-or-nothing armoured vessels. Although it should be noted that nobody actually ever built, post, the mid-ironclad period, a truly all-or-nothing vessel. There were still patches of essentially destroyer gunfire or splinter-proof armour in areas other than the Citadel, most usually over things like the steering gear and so forth. But these were really to protect the ship against either near misses or encounters with random destroyer gunfire in those vital but outside of Citadel areas. They weren't in any way, shape or form designed to really resist a direct hit from anything a battleship might throw their way. Fabian Zimmerman asks, in Book 5, A Victory of Eagles, of the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, that takes place during the Napoleonic Wars, albeit with dragons, there's a scene during a naval battle where a cannonball that had been fired by the enemy ship was rolling around the inside of the ship that was fired upon. A bored sailor decides to stop the shell by putting his foot in front of it, and instead the cannonball takes his foot off and keeps rolling without even slowing down. Is this accurate? Could a rolling cannonball take someone's foot off like this? I have actually read the first few books of the Temeraire series when they first came out. I got up I think it was either book 4 or book 5. I got up to the part where Temeraire and his captain had been exiled due to helping the French out with the Dragon Plague, but I haven't read beyond that as of yet. Maybe I should catch up with it. Nonetheless, back to the question, it depends on the speed and weight of the cannonball. Now, this is attested to, this kind of thing of, having your foot torn off by a rolling cannonball happens a reasonable amount in land battles. I mean, it's not the most common thing ever, but it does definitely happen. Now, on a ship, I think it's going to depend in large part of what speed that cannonball is going at. So if the cannonball has been fired and it's punched through the side of the ship and it's rolling along the deck for whatever reason, it's coming at a low angle and it's basically just still travelling with a good amount of velocity coming down the deck and someone tries to stop it, yes, at that point it probably would take your foot off. However, if the ball has come through the ship, let's say it's hit the other side, hit a beam or something, bounced off, come to rest, and is now just rolling around with the motion of the ship, then no, it wouldn't take your foot off. This question prompted me down an interesting rabbit hole of looking at artificially generated ankle and lower leg fractures, which people do on cadavered legs in order to assess what kind of damage different types of impact can do, which is all a little bit gruesome, but nonetheless, as it turns out, if you have something like a 24-pounder cannonball rolling around doing about 30 miles an hour, that's going to be enough to cause what you could term a violently displaced broken ankle, i.e. it's going to roll into you, it's going to hit you with enough power that it's going to shatter your ankle and it's going to keep going because it's basically going to fold your foot over like in sort of at 90 degrees, which is not a good thing. You'd actually be better off if it ran over the front part of your foot because you might end up with some very broken foot bones, but you wouldn't be quite in the same place as if it actually hit your ankle nonetheless. So if you're talking about a 9 or a 12-pounder or an 18-pounder ball, then it would have to be rolling a little bit faster to do similar damage, but even at slower speeds, like 20 miles an hour or something, they'd still break your ankle. They might not just fold it over like wet toilet paper. If it's a 32-pounder shot from a much heavier gun, from a ship of the line or something like that, then obviously it can be going slower, but at 30 it might actually start to start displacing bits of your foot as well. But those kinds of speeds are it's a ballpark speed that I chose to represent a ship that was maybe violently heeling and the ball is just accelerating and someone's going, oh well, that's moving, right, I'll try and stop it, as opposed to a ball that's potentially moving a lot faster than that, maybe 50, 60 or more miles an hour, because it's coming off of the end of its actual flight, at which point, yeah, that would take your foot off, more than likely. Galdir Ioni asks, regarding sailing frigate beats U-boat, that made me wonder, would a World War II submarine have had difficulties picking up a sailing vessel on hydrophones? Obviously, a sailing ship of any given size would be significantly easier to visually detect on the surface compared to a steam or diesel-powered vessel, but I think long-range detection tended to happen via hydrophone. Certainly these days submarines use essentially hydrophone - modern descendant of the hydrophone, aka passive sonar, to conduct long-range and even to a certain degree short-range detection. Back in World War II, hydrophones were somewhat less sensitive and somewhat less developed, so they were harder to use for those purposes, but they still could be used. Famously, at the Battle of Denmark Strait, Prince Eugen's hydrophones operators managed to pick up Prince of Wales and Hood whilst they were still visually speaking over the horizon, and later on Prince Eugen's hydrophone operators would say that they heard the noises of torpedoes coming in, which would be from Hood, could only be from Hood at that point. And while there is some argument about what did they hear, etc., etc., the simple fact is, if Prince Eugen's hydrophone operators were good enough to pick up Admiral Holland's force over the horizon, I think at a few thousand yards they're probably good enough to work out whether or not there's a torpedo in their immediate vicinity. They didn't suddenly get hit by the stupid pill halfway through the battle. But anyway, getting back to U-boats, yes, they did have hydrophones. Yes, they did use them to pick up convoys, albeit that it was very dependent on weather conditions, because as I said, less sensitive. And obviously there's a difference between picking up the noise of lots of ships in a convoy versus a single ship, which is obviously only going to have 1 or 2 screws if it's a merchant vessel. And the submarine had to usually come to near enough a complete stop in order for the hydrophones to be the most effective they could be, because things like flow noise around the mostly surface-orientated hull of a U-boat and the engines, obviously at that point running on electric power, would complicate matters for the listener. None. But, with all that said, yes, if there was a sailing vessel going around, there's no screw noise to listen to, assuming, well, at this point, sail-powered ocean-going ships would usually, certainly in World War II, have a backup or secondary power plant of some description. For the most part, not necessarily always, but for the most part. But if they weren't running that and they were just running on sail power, then yeah, it would be incredibly difficult to pick them up via hydrophones. If you picked up anything at all, you'd be picking up either the faint hiss of the hull moving through the water, which is fairly unlikely that you'd hear it on a U-boat's hydrophone system, or you might pick up the slamming of the waves as they hit the hull, if the waves are particularly high. But yeah, effectively, if you're looking for a ship to stealthily sneak past long-range hydrophone detecting by a wolf pack, a sail ship is about as good as you're going to get. And you just hope one isn't close enough to stick its periscope up and go, oh, a bunch of sails, I wonder what that could be. Because, of course, at that point, you're almost certainly going to be slower than the average power plant primary using merchant vessel. And the U-boat's going to make fairly quick work of you. Ian Carr asks, headroom in HMS Unicorn's gun decks looks much more generous than on Victory, though reducing in height lower down. Why was this, and why reduce headroom as you go lower down? Well, as I took primarily video, here's me silently nattering away to myself on HMS Unicorn's gun deck for you to enjoy. So the reason that Unicorn as a frigate has a considerably higher gun deck than those available on HMS Victory is simply because, well, she has only the one gun deck, and therefore they can afford to have that somewhat higher than on Victory, where of course they don't want to go too high in order to not compromise the stability of the ship, but they have to squeeze 3 gun decks between the waterline and a point of diminishing returns on stability and handling. And you have to factor in things like freeboard and elevation enough so that you're not at an immediate disadvantage in boarding actions against other ships, a vantage point that's not based on the masts for the officers, and so on and so forth. And therefore you want to have a certain minimum height for your upper decks, and thus when you take into account that there's obviously also a minimum ideal height from the waterline for the guns, that space in between can all just be gun deck. And of course there's the additional efficiency advantages of having a taller gun deck, which means people can move around more freely, which improves the rate of fire of the guns and improves general habitability of the ship. And of course, by being a large open space, okay, the guns are quite heavy, but by having this taller deck, it makes that height of the ship, sort of 7-8 plus feet of it, relatively speaking, outside of the gun weight, a light portion of the ship, which, considering it's the second highest deck, full deck on the ship, then that's obviously a very good thing. However, as for why the heights of the decks reduce, and you see the same thing on USS Constitution, as you go below the main gun deck, well, simply put, the amenities value of being able to work the guns more efficiently is irrelevant outside of the gun deck itself. And as much as you have certain minimum heights above the waterline for the gun ports and so on and so forth, once you get below the gun deck, there is only so much ship before you hit the keel, and you don't want that to be too far, because otherwise, if you have too much draft, then you're going to start hitting underwater obstructions, you can't fit into so many harbours, it's not good hydrodynamically, etc. And within that space, you've got to fit the ballast, you've got to fit the ammunition, you've got to fit the spare rope, the spare sails, spare bits of timber, for repairs, whether that be spars or partial masts and so forth, accommodation for most of the crew, your stores, be that water, food, etc., etc., etc. And thus, space, once you get below the gun deck, is at an extreme premium. And thus, on a frigate at least, the next deck down is largely accommodation for the bulk of the crew, but they only really need enough space to just about stand up in. They're going to spend most of their time seated eating, seated doing other activities, or sleeping. So, yeah, you might as well reduce the height there. Saves a bit more space for other things lower down. And once you get further down into the ship, with all those other bits, including the magazines, well, at that point, you only need enough space to be able to work to store or remove those storage items, and the ability of somebody to fully stand in order to do that is very secondary at that point, as compared to, if we make the height of these decks somewhat shorter, we can fit more in them, and thus we can have more things stored in there. Plus, of course, the denser the decking gets in terms of how many decks there are below the water, that puts more weight below the waterline, which makes the ship more stable as well. It's a relatively minor consideration, but it does save a little bit on ballast and so forth. So, yeah, that's basically why you see the headroom decreasing, as effectively the human importance factor goes down and down and down further lower into the ship. And that's enough of me randomly talking on Unicorn. Chief Eyeroll asks, following up on your Ships Too Angry to Die segment in Dry Dock 228 Part 1, at the Battle of the Tsushima Straits, the armoured cruiser Nishin was attached to the Japanese battle line, and even ended up at the head of the line under fire for half an hour. By the end of the battle, she'd taken the second most hits of the battle line, second only to Mikasa. The ship had been riddled and nearly disarmed. What factors contributed to the ship surviving this battle? It was basically luck combined with Russian shells. And as I mentioned in the video on the Battle of Tsushima itself and subsequently, Russian shells were not as powerful as their Japanese equivalents due to having an older powder mix, and they did occasionally have issues, not necessarily issues detonating, but issues detonating in a appropriately violent manner. A fair number of Russian shells seem to have suffered from low order detonations. And that combines with the location of the shell hits. Now, that's a very important thing because, the only way to rapidly sink a warship is to either let lots of water in the bottom or to hit something like a magazine. The shells that hit Nishin didn't come close to penetrating a magazine or setting one on fire, so she was relatively safe from exploding. And the one shell that hit her, well, two shells, I guess, that hit her on or near the waterline, one of them failed to penetrate the belt, and the other one managed to penetrate, but then flooded a coal bunker, the coal, I guess, at that point serving as a secondary form of armour, and the coal bunker bulkheads internally held. So while she suffered a little bit of flooding, it wasn't catastrophic. So without any catastrophic waterline or near waterline hits, and without firing the magazine, she wasn't really in any particular danger of sinking, although, as you mentioned, she was rendered pretty much combat ineffective, as you can see here by the state of her forward main turret. If she'd been hit by Japanese shells equivalent, i.e. 12-inch filled with Shimose and so forth, then whilst she still wouldn't have been at risk of exploding, then perhaps there might have been a significantly greater risk of fire, especially on the upper decks. I doubt a single 12-inch shell, even with Shimose, could have set fire to the coal bunker, especially with the flooding thereafter, but perhaps dangerous fires in the upper portion of the ship might have spread if they killed enough of the crew to make damage control fairly difficult, and she might have therefore have had to have been abandoned. But in the end, she wasn't being shot at with Shimose-filled shells, so she was okay. Richard Goss asks, was any consideration made to rearming the counties with 666-inch turrets, given that the Royal Navy was looking for more volume of fire? And do you think this would have improved their performance, with the exception of North Cape? I don't believe there was any such plan considered. A number of reasons for that, actually. Firstly, manufacturing of guns and turrets, etc., was still a little bit bottlenecked in the UK. So if you've got ships armed with perfectly adequate guns, why why rearm them when you can use those same gun turrets to build even more ships? Secondly, the barbette diameter for the 666 was greater than that for the Twin 8, so it wouldn't really be an easy thing to do. Not only would you have to go through, even assuming, if you assume that everything is the same diameter, you'd still have to rip out all the shell hoist systems, the magazine handling arrangements, etc. It'd be hugely expensive. But in this case, that's not the case, because the barbette diameter being smaller would mean you'd also have to rip out the entirety of the barbette, make the whole thing 3 foot wider at least, and then drop in the new barbette system, at which point, again, cost-wise, you might as well just build a bunch of brand new ships instead. So it's not really a compatible thing. The Megami's rearming from 6 to 8, which is going the other direction, is a rather specific thing, because although the size indicates you can do the upgrade, the fact is, if you want the barbette diameters to be exactly the same, you have to pre-plan for that, and the Royal Navy didn't pre-plan for that because that wasn't the idea. Also, the 8-inch gun does have some advantages over the 6-inch gun in certain engagement profiles, which the Royal Navy did appreciate, and therefore, they retained the counties because of that, partly because other people had 8-inch cruisers, but also partly because the 8-inch gun does have a longer range and can penetrate more armour, which means that the 8-inch gun has some capability engaging enemy capital ships. Now, this isn't kind of like armoured cruisers taking a secondary part in the battle line kind of thing, but if you engage an enemy capital ship and you have a heavy cruiser or two standing nearby, then them salvoing 8-inch shells into your opponent, it's not going to penetrate their citadel or anything, but it might do some fairly significant damage to the more exposed portions of the ship. And, well, you can look at the wreck of Bismarck to see the mess that Dorsetshire made of some parts of the ship. Plus, as I mentioned, the range issues in a straight-up fleet engagement. The consideration that increased rate of fire of the 6-inch would allow you to overwhelm an 8-inch cruiser specifically, that did hold true at closer ranges. The problem, as it turned out, in some cases, was actually establishing and getting to those closer ranges. Just look at what happened in the Mediterranean. If the Italian cruisers, which to be fair also had something of a habit of opening fire at the outer ends of range, but when Italian heavy cruiser formation showed up and they were facing off against purely Royal Navy light cruiser formations, usually the Royal Navy cruiser formations ended up having to fall back. Again, this was also partly due to the fact that the Italians could keep the range comfortably open because they had some very fast cruisers, and the fact that a lot of the cruisers in the Royal Navy's formations tended to be Leanders, Arethusas and Didos as opposed to Towns. But still, the issue kind of does arise. Ironically, given the fact that the Japanese were constantly trying to get more heavy cruisers, where the 6-inch cruiser definitely does have an advantage over the 8-inch is the kind of close range night fighting knife range actions that you see in the Pacific War. Yokosuka Girls Maritime High School training vessel Harikaze asks, I was reading the book Hitler's Violent Youth, How Trench Warfare and Street Fighting Moulded Hitler, and at one point it mentions that Hitler's regiment was sent to Ostend to guard it during the end of August and partway through September 1918, but this was also seen as a bit of a relief for them after heavy fighting. Whilst there, he saw U-boats and had a chance to go aboard to look around. Other sources indicate he also undertook a short journey aboard one. Is there any way to know which U-boats were stationed or put in at Ostend during this period, and could this have been the start of Hitler's love of the submarine? Whilst I can't necessarily speak to any particular love affair with U-boats that Hitler had, I mean, the simple fact is that any analysis of the First World War and general naval strategy compared with Germany's industrial potential in the interwar period would have informed practically anyone that the only chance of significantly affecting a large naval power like Britain would have been a mass U-boat campaign. So, who knows exactly where this took root in his mind. But nonetheless, if you want to look at the end of August and partway through September 1918 at Ostend, that's the Flanders Flotilla, and yes, it is possible to know which U-boats were there. In fact, there were quite a few there. So going through the various submarines that were present in parts of August, late August and early September 1918, and excluding those that were lost towards the end of August, because I'm going to make a general presumption that if they were lost in the closing stages of August, then that means they were probably at sea for most of the second part of August and therefore wouldn't have been present when Hitler was. Nonetheless, the U-boats that I believe were present in the Flanders Flotilla during that period would be of the UB class, UB 10, 40, 59, 103, 104, 113, 115 and 116, and possibly UB 80. And then the UC boats, UC 4, 8, 48 and 40, with potentially UC 17 and UC 71 present as well. Rebel Skvirl asks, in what ways did Royal Navy anti-aircraft tactics evolve during World War II as a result of combat experience? Boy, that could be a Wednesday video in and of itself, but I'll try and go over some of the highlights. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that the Royal Navy's anti-aircraft tactics changed several times during World War II, adapting to different strategies and tactics that were being used by different attackers. But in broader terms, they more widely introduced anti-aircraft fire control directors to the fleet, and they improved their anti-aircraft fire control director systems. As I've mentioned before, the HACS system, High Angle Control System, that is not a single unified system. There are multiple versions and variants thereof, and in true British fashion, as with a lot of stuff that the British had in the Second World War, the sequential numbering doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting better with every version, because there are downsized versions designed for use on destroyers that may or may not be more capable than larger versions that are installed on battleships but might have an older numerical value, or they might have a high numerical value. It's all over the place. But nonetheless, introducing more and better systems, and that included acknowledging both the manufacturing limitations that Britain had at the time, plus also just the flat-out superiority of things like the Mark 38 system and getting those in where they could. Then you also had, for example, with heavy anti-aircraft guns, initially you had the concept that smaller ships could be armed with dual-purpose heavy anti-aircraft weapons like a 4.7-inch gun, but these guns didn't need to be able to elevate to significant elevations because they would only be escorting larger ships, and surely the enemy aircraft would be attacking the larger ships, and thus you needed to fire crossways to target the aircraft that were targeting the larger ships and not you on your small destroyer. That turned out to be a fairly big mistake, so during the war there was a continuous effort to varying degrees to try and get a 4.5 or 4.7-inch weapon with very high angles of elevation, which could then be used on destroyers, so that they had a lot more personal defense against high angle attacks, whether that be level bombing or dive bombing or whatever. There was also a development of the appreciation for lighter and medium anti-aircraft weapons. So a lot of Royal Navy ships, if we temporarily don't look at the ones like the 5.25-inch Didos or Didos, a lot of Royal Navy ships started the war with 4-inch or 4.5 or 4.7-inch heavy AA and some pom-poms, whether single, twin, quad or octuple mounts, i.e. a medium AA weapon, and that was considered fine. But it rapidly became clear that whilst the octuple pom-pom was a fairly ferocious thing to direct at a single target, in the grand scheme of things as far as pom-poms were concerned, having a few quad or octuple installations certainly in the early to mid part of the war was perhaps not as good a thing as having the same number of guns present in smaller installations. So instead of having a single octuple, for example, having a quad and two twins spread around the ship actually gave you better coverage and a better chance of downing aircraft than relying on everything being centered on a few larger mounts. But that changed again when you got towards the end of the war with the kamikazes, when all of a sudden it turned out, well, if the kamikaze's coming straight at you, being able to just mag dump 8 barrels of 40mm ammunition into the face of a kamikaze is a very, very good way of just erasing it from the sky in a way that a single or twin pom-pom or Bofors just couldn't. And then the appreciation that you do need lighter anti-aircraft weapons. Initially, the Oerlikon was looked at as a light anti-aircraft weapon to defend merchant ships, but very rapidly spread through the fleet. But then towards the end of the war was itself being superseded by just sticking more Bofors and pom-poms everywhere you could go. And then you have, of course, various efforts to get stabilised mounts, Haselmeier mounts, Stag mounts, etc. Because, again, it turns out that having your gun mount staying relatively on the same level while they're trying to fire at a moving target is much better than if they're fixed and thus also moving with the ship that's there aboard. Heavy anti-aircraft doctrine went through a number of different iterations. First they were looking at trying to bracket an area of the sky that the planes were passing through and keeping that up and hoping to hit something. That didn't work out too brilliantly. Then they moved to barrage fire, where you tried to lay down a curtain of fire that the aircraft had to fly into, and that worked relatively well against the Germans and the Italians, but turned out not to work too well against the Japanese, at which point they had to revert to a slightly more accurate version of actually trying to target the aircraft rather than targeting a box in the sky. And, it goes back and forth like this. And then once you get to the end of the war, the 5.25 almost becomes to a certain degree an aerial sniper with radar-directed fire control because of its fairly long range for a vaguely capable anti-aircraft gun of the time. Crete would lead to things like appreciating how much anti-aircraft ammunition you should have left before you decided to call it quits and head home for resupply. Formation tactics and how fleets grouped their anti-aircraft fire together. That evolved over time, again changing several times because the attack patterns of, let's say, German medium bombers in the North Sea versus Italian heavy torpedo bombers and Italian and German dive bombers in the Mediterranean versus Japanese aircraft in the Pacific were all very different. So there's a constant evolution, and as I mentioned briefly before with barrage fire, for example, sometimes something that was actually fairly effective against an incoming Japanese or Italian attack turned out to be fairly ineffective against Italian or German attack turned out to be ineffective against a Japanese attack, or stuff that was actually very effective against the Japanese wasn't particularly effective against the Germans or the Italians. And so it's not just a linear progression of, well, this thing happened and then they've realised this and it got better. Quite often it's a very jumping around pattern, and sometimes even a recursive pattern where a return to older tactics actually works better against some new enemy initiative. Texas and LaShock asks, since you've referenced Fiddler on the Roof, what are some things that are done in various navies that can fit Tervia's line, why do we do these things? I don't know, but it is our tradition. There are a wide variety of naval traditions, some of which have had some fairly nasty results, others are just quite light-hearted. So the sinking of HMS Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy was in part simply due to the fact that there was a tradition in the Royal Navy that there should always be what at that point was called cruiser, but previously frigate, squadron patrolling in that area, and so, they were at war, so they were going to have a cruiser squadron patrolling in that area, regardless of the fact that a number of officers pointed out it would be much better to have fast scout cruisers or destroyers patrolling the area rather than big old armoured cruisers, which, as it turned out, was a pretty good call to make. There should have been someone else there, not these things. In other traditions, you've got things like the use of the bosun's whistle for piping people on and off the ship and various other things. Technically speaking, modern PA systems and so forth could easily replace that, but it is a tradition in the Navy, and so they keep on going with it. Plus, of course, a bosun's whistle isn't going to be affected by electrical power shortages, and to be perfectly honest, a simple rising and falling note of a whistle is, as it was in the Age of Sail, probably much easier to hear and recognise in rough sea conditions as opposed to whatever garbled nonsense might come out of a PA system. And then you have relatively minor ones like in the Royal Navy, when you toast now the King, previously the Queen, you do that sitting down. pretty much all other toasts, as most people who've ever had to give a toast or been present at one will be aware, are given standing up. The reason that the loyal toast on the Royal Navy is given sitting down actually goes way, 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 way back to the early part of the 19th century, when the king at the time had previously spent time in the Royal Navy, but he was a relatively tall man, and whenever he'd had to toast to the king or other toasts, he'd had to stand up. And as you can imagine, on a Royal Navy ship at that point, if you're particularly tall, then every time you stand up, there's a reasonably good chance of smashing your head into a beam. And having been thoroughly fed up with that, as soon as he got himself into power, he decided, right, no one in the Navy has to stand up for that particular toast anymore, which probably preserved the craniums of a good many naval officers. And finally for this week, Jellicoe Cats Get Confused at Night asks, during your recent series on US pre-war fleet problems, you documented the US Navy's habit of launching air raids on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Was the US Army Air Corps involved in these exercises? And if so, why didn't they take the hint? They were definitely involved in multiple US Navy air attacks on Pearl Harbor during various fleet problems. And, well, as for why they didn't take the hint from all of that, there's a few reasons. Unfortunately, some of the reasons they're perfectly, well, they're not perfectly valid, but they're not perfectly valid reasons, but they're perfectly valid as explanations because they are factual. But they do tend to tread a little bit close towards some of the more interesting conspiracy theories surrounding Pearl Harbor. Nonetheless, part of the issue was basically a lackadaisical overconfidence. I guess in some ways you might call it a cultural arrogance. One of the things that came out during the investigations after Pearl Harbor was that a good number of people thought, but it's a Sunday. No one's going to attack on a Sunday. Well, why is nobody going to attack on a Sunday? And it's kind of this amorphous assumption that no one would attack on a Sunday because Sunday is a day of rest, except for the fact, of course, that the concept of Sunday as a day of rest really only originates with, European and, I guess then at that point, American Christianity. But this kind of misses the point that Japan, as a primarily Shinto religion country, doesn't ascribe, as far as I'm aware, any particular value or importance to Sundays. Then you also had the overall low to mid-level racism that was going on in both the US Navy and the US Army against the Japanese as a people. The idea of Japan mounting a very careful sneak attack with a large carrier fleet ahead of anyone in the US getting any significant notice of what they were doing seemed completely impossible to comprehend to some officers, especially if you read the pre-war reports. And then finally, and this is where you start to verge onto people grabbing onto this as evidence of conspiracies, you have the fact that some US officers, both in the US Navy and the US Army Air Force or US Army Air Corps, did take these warnings seriously. Admiral Richardson, for example, who was in charge of the US Pacific Fleet, was previously based down on the US West Coast, and he was told, right, you're going to move the fleet over to Pearl Harbor. And he took one look at Pearl Harbor and presumably took a look at the fleet problem results and went, that is incredibly dangerous and probably stupid, and Pearl Harbor isn't ready to defend us and we will possibly get attacked, and basically therefore refused to move the fleet to Pearl Harbor, at which point the political element of the US government, I suppose that is kind of a self-fulfilling thing anyway, but anyway, the president turned around and said, well, if you don't want to support my policy of moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor as a deterrent against Japan, I'll find someone who will. And so Admiral Richardson was sacked, and they found an admiral who was willing to move the fleet to Pearl Harbor. So although that's obviously the naval side of things, that's the part I know about. I'm not 100% sure about what was going on the Army Air Force side of things, but I suspect that, likely, again, any officer who stuck their head above the parapet and said, we're probably not ready, we need some more defences, fighters, more patrols, etc., was probably told to pipe down and shut up or risk losing their job. And where I think the dividing line with that information goes from reasonable historical analysis to conspiracy is that whole thing of never ascribe to malice what you can to stupidity. And yeah, if it's stupidity, which isn't exactly short in political circles, that drove the politicians to make this call, well, it would just be a yet another stupid call in a long, sad history of stupid calls made by politicians. Whereas if you ascribe it to malice aforethought, then that's where you get into the whole thing of the US, or at least elements of the US government, supposedly planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor, which I personally don't subscribe to, because even if you did want to expose the US fleet for some reason to provoke a war or something, your desire to do so doesn't force the Japanese to send the Kido Butai on a very long secret route to attack Pearl Harbor. It doesn't give you psychic compulsion powers. But in any case, that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully by the time that you are listening to this, I will be back from the US, or possibly actually still in flight somewhere over the US or the Atlantic Ocean. Nevertheless, I hope I will land safely, and I will be greeting you all soon. See you later. Bye.